Today, we're going to be talking about sales management that works. Sales management that works. How to sell in a world that never stops changing. This is the book Frank released this year, if not late last year, and an extremely interesting read. I'd encourage everybody to pick this up right now. Today, we're going to be talking about Frank along the sections of his book. So he breaks it down into people, process, pricing, and partners in terms of the three core sections. But there's so much data and value in Frank's book. These are not internet platitudes that you're going to pick up. This is fact-based research, which is absolutely incredibly valuable, which is why we're so incredibly excited to have Frank here. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Frank to join us here. Come on, Frank. There he is. First of all,
a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for that gracious introduction. In fact, after an introduction like that, I can hardly wait to hear what I have to say. Thank you very, very much.
Fantastic. Well, you know, Frank, the list of accolades for your book is so long, it resembles my list of creditors, frankly. So it's unbelievable how well received your books are. And one thing to the community here, gang, we've been really lucky here today. Frank has provided us lots of signed copies of his book. So as we go through our discussion here today, I'm going to encourage you to start share some of your great questions in the chat feature. And Neil and I will monitor those. If we use one of your great questions with Frank in a few minutes here, we'll be sure to send you a great signed copy of Frank's book, So just for our friends who join us on the podcast at a later date here, Frank, I'll reiterate, just say, hey, Frank, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much for hosting me. My pleasure.
So Frank, first of all, how are things over at Harvard these days? Is everything back to in-person classes? Is everybody on site wearing masks and those types of things back to normal a little bit?
The answer is generally yes. I teach in both the MBA and executive programs. And with the executives, for the most part, we're now back in the classroom, everybody masked. Same with the MBAs, but MBAs will always have a social life. They throw very big parties, and as a result, last month at least, we had to go back to virtual for 2 weeks because the incidence of positive tests spiked up.
Well, I guess you just can't take the student out of the university student.
That very well put. That's
you know,
right.
so a real part of the culture there for sure. And you know, Frank, with all of the work you've done, did I get that right? By the way, we're at 7 books now.
Yes, that's right.
Books. And did you see how I used the royal we? I'm almost taking credit for some of your books here. What prompted you to write this one? So with everything you've done in the past, and some of the books have touched on, you know, sales leadership, what prompted you to write Sales Management That Works?
Well, I think that's a good and fair question, because it's not like the world is waiting breathlessly for yet another book about sales, right? We've got tens of thousands, but I had 2 motivations. One motivation is that sales is by far the most context-specific activity in business. You know, once I say this, it will sound obvious, but I'm stunned throughout my career how smart, well-educated people nod and then forget this. Selling software is different than selling capital goods, different than selling professional services. Selling in North America is different than selling in Latin America, Asia, right, the Middle East. And yet, while it's very context-specific, it's the area of business where so many people feel so confident making huge generalizations, unsupported by any data beyond what in academia we would call N equals 1. You know, when I sold for Oracle, when we invested in PayPal. So, you know, I ran a business for 11 years, had to meet payroll. I've done, I think, a fair amount of research on the topic. I wanted to write a book that says this is what research does and does not tell you about this core activity. And I think it's a good time for a book like that. There's no doubt that online technologies are affecting buying and selling, no doubt whatsoever. But my reading of what people say about that, I think simply misunderstands the managerial implications and where the technology is and is not having an effect. So those were my motivations behind this book.
Well, what a great point you bring out about, all of us today have more information, but I'm not so sure we're better informed. And it's, we're grabbing that last, internet platitude and trying to apply it to, what we do, particularly in selling. I've noticed this for years in sales because, there's so many of us in sales, as you aptly point out in the book. I think you say 11% of the population of the US, excluding all of these roles that have a key component as a salesperson. So it's very much an undercounted number. So we're all in professional sales, but so few have actually received professional sales training.
Yeah.
Even though the amount of money spent on professional sales training is enormous, as you aptly point out, the $14.59 per person, 70 billion a year. All training is 70 billion a year, but just flabbergasting numbers in terms of investments being made.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, the reality is that companies already spend a ton of money on hiring, training, and rehiring salespeople because turnover in sales tends to modulate between 20 and 30% annually. And obviously in a market like this, right now, it is clearly, a seller's market.
Right.
The turnover is even higher because people with talent and a track record have more options. But the ROI there is not particularly glorious.
Right.
You also make, I think, an important point that affects hiring. There's no established talent pool for salespeople.
Right.
It's not like there's one degree you get as you do when you're an engineer or a programmer. It's an area where companies have to work harder at getting what they need.
Well, it's so interesting. So in the Harvard curriculum today, and then really we're just an interest for me, how many courses are dedicated to professional sales? If an MBA takes 22 courses or something like that, how many courses are dedicated to professional sales?
Well, at Harvard Business School, the way our curriculum works is that in the first year, they're all required courses. You get no choice as a student. Then in the second year, it's all choice, nothing required. In the first year, if you look at the marketing course, at entrepreneurial management, which is what I've taught for a couple of years, you'll see sales touched on glancingly.
Right.
But then in the second year, and I'll take some credit for this because I was, for years the pioneer here, I think we now have 1, 2, 3, 4 courses that are either about selling or sales management. Now, interestingly, the student attitude toward that topic has changed dramatically in my career.
Wow.
You were kind enough at the beginning of this session to hold up my previous book, Aligning Strategy and Sales.
Right.
When 20 years ago, when I was teaching this topic, I had to work to make the students appreciate sales. And my message, I had to work the first month to say, listen, if you want to work for a strategy consulting firm or be an investor, you better know something about sales. I had to work at that. Now it's the opposite. Now the students, because of their interest in entrepreneurial this, entrepreneurial that, they're crazy about sales. And I've got to work to explain to them that sales without a coherent strategy can only take you just so far. So, the wheel turns as it does perpetually in business.
How great that you were on the front end of it, though. So the way 150 years ago when I did my MBA back in 2005, 3 courses in finance, 4 in marketing, and sales was one chapter of one course.
Yeah.
And so just shocking. And I had enough background and experience then, because I was a little older doing the MBA, that I talked to the leadership of the academic institution. Great school, you know, Ivy in Canada is a good business school, but there was really no appetite to do anything with sales. It was really seen as a portion of marketing, which was, you know, pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So we talked about this tenure, Frank, on you know, salespeople, a lot of churn, very interesting time. I've never seen it like this in my 20 years in sales, where there's so much demand and not enough supply of capable salespeople. What are your thoughts at the sales management level? I mean, I'm sure you've seen the same research I've seen that says the tenure of a VP of sales is, you know, crazy low. Some organizations pointed at about 2 years or less in terms of the tenure. What are you seeing with your research out there about the churn on sales leaders and their average tenure?
Well, let me respond to two levels, because one is, you're quite right. I think, you know, there's a supply chain disruption in human capital, just as there is in a lot of goods. Here, and I see this on boards that I sit on, companies I work with, and one of the things I always tell the people doing the hiring is, remember one of the oldest aphorisms in business: ultimately, you hire your problems. Even when the market is the way it is today, you're very often better off not hiring someone than hiring the wrong person, because sooner or later you'll pay for it. So you do have to get back to basics. Now, in terms of the tenure and the nature of the job for sales leaders, yes, you're right. You know, this is the way it was for years with CIOs, chief information officers.
Oh, okay.
Now this is the case with CSOs, chief sales officers. And my own feeling is that you're going to find that pressure and that compression in sales leadership jobs will continue, and I'm afraid may accelerate for a couple of reasons. One is the nature of the job is changing. It is. There is a data revolution taking place that will continue throughout our lifetimes. And the reality is that sales in many companies for decades was basically a black box, right? If you met your numbers, essentially the CEO and the C-suite left you alone.
Yeah.
Those days are changing because of the data revolution. Sales is more transparent, and the activities in sales are more transparent to the rest of the company, and especially those annoying people in finance. Because once people in finance get data, they ask questions. And the net result, and I think this is part of what you see driving this turnover in sales leadership, the requirements for financial literacy in sales are increasing exponentially. And by financial literacy, I mean more than understanding top-line motion. I mean understanding cash in, cash out, return on invested capital, cost to serve, etc. And that's a big portion, I think, of what you see going on. I don't think it will abate. And indeed, I think we're going to see more and more data, more and more analytical tools, more and more questions that sales leaders are going to be expected to have answers to.
What an interesting point about this, how difficult the role is. Because, you know, I always felt even before, you know, this let's call it data revolution that's taking place, I always thought sales leadership was the hardest job on the executive team, because for a couple of reasons. We have the three most demanding stakeholders in business. So number one, customers, most important stakeholder, obviously, but certainly demanding. So when you're in front of clients, I've got my teammates around the executive table who are extremely demanding. And my success criteria, I'm the only one at that table whose performance evaluation and success criteria is public domain, right? We're either hitting our number or we're not. I don't know how my head of HR or head of marketing is really doing. They know how I'm doing.
Yeah.
So that adds a lot of pressure to the mix. And then the third element is I actually am running the sales team, and they need a lot of care and feeding and attention and coaching. They need coaching. And our experience, Frank, is with the companies that we work with and the sales leaders that we coach and support, when the pressure is on, particularly with that relentless quarterly cadence, the first thing that falls off the table is coaching.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
so I think that's right.
Yeah.
The reality, I can assure you, Mark, that if you talk to the head of operations, the head of supply chain, the CFO, they're all going to say, I've got the toughest job.
Yeah,
right?
sure.
I do think there are a couple of things that make sales leadership particularly vulnerable, if you will. One is, you're exactly right. Sales is the tip of the spear with the external environment. And the reality is lots of things determine sales outcomes besides leadership, the skills of the salesperson. And many of those things in the external market are outside of the control of the CS. So, think about the pandemic. That's number one. Right. Number two is the external environment is changing. One of the issues besides the data revolution is the changes in buying. It is an omni-channel buying world, and a lot of sales forces need to manage both the online and in-person interactions, and that's a big chore facing many sales leaders. And then the third element, and here many sales leaders are complicit in this issue, if I can be candid. Managing change in sales is always difficult. And the reason is that so many other decisions in a company depend on sales forecasts and the ability to meet those forecasts.
Yeah.
That's why, look at the jargon that surrounds sales: predictable revenue, the science of selling, right? Sales has to meet the numbers quarterly, annually. The metrics support that. So many sales leaders, because of that, stick with the devil they know, even when the external market changes. That's how you get disrupted, and ultimately that's how you get fired.
Well, I love it. I love in your book, and we're going to come back to that in a second. I want to come back to the buyer's journey, but I love in your book how you reference that a lot of sales leaders, when they come in and take a role, or even CEOs of mid-sized businesses, their view of selling is what they used to do 5 or 10 years ago. And it's just not, they bring their old playbook to the table. And I always like this analogy. I'm Canadian, Frank, so of course I'm a hockey player.
Yeah.
And of course, I played lots and lots of hockey, but I was a goalie. And when I stepped away for 15 or 20 years, and then I went back to playing goal, I used to play out because I enjoyed it. And then I went back to playing net. It was a completely different position. And frankly, it was easier than when I played. But I needed more training, had to start over again. It was completely different. And I think that's one of the challenges today. I think the sales leader, in our experience with let's call it the hundreds that we've trained thousands of salespeople, but hundreds of sales leaders. I think they come from a world where they weren't open to taking outside help. And now the role is so complicated, it's tough for them to be an expert at everything, as you aptly point out. A great coach, a great leader, great at sales, great data analytics, complete sales operations, so deep in technology. But it's not in the DNA to ask for help or support, or to declare this is not something I'm great at.
Yeah.
And so they bring those old playbooks to the table, and they're just not working at all today.
Yeah, well, I think there are two things going on, and I agree with you. One is, I'll get back to one of the initial things I said when you asked me why the book. Sales is context specific. And again, once I say this, it will sound obvious, but in business, there is no such thing as performance in the abstract. That Platonic ideal does not exist in business. There's only performance in our company, in our market, with our products today. And when somebody goes from company A to company B, they leave all that behind. They've got to recreate it. in the specific context. The other thing, and here I think the what you might call the psychological barrier that you're talking about, I think is a big one because of the data revolution, because of the online, offline interactions that affect most businesses. Sales is more of a cross-functional activity than it was in the past. And if you're running sales, you do need, A, you need business acumen, not just sales acumen, and B, you do have to link with the other folks in your company.
Yes.
And, you know, you're not going to be an expert in everything. Nobody is that expert, including the CEO.
Right. Well, and team, I'm going to remind everybody watching today, please, just as a reminder, send us your questions on the chat feature. And you can message us through LinkedIn Navigator or Facebook, LinkedIn Live or Facebook. But those on the webinar, send us your questions. And if we use your questions in a few minutes, we'll send you a signed copy of Frank's book, Sales Management That Works.
And you don't have to write a book report if you get that book.
Okay, my team does, by the way, but everybody, nobody else does. Nobody else does. So Frank, you touched on this great thing about the the way the changes that are taking place in this ever-changing world. One of them was the buyer's journey, and I know you've been involved with Gardner when they came up with what a lot of us call their spaghetti diagram.
Yep.
Your book, you talk about explore, evaluate, engage, and then experience as the buyer's journey, but it's not serial or linear. Let's talk a little bit about that, how things are changing on the buyer's side and how important it is for all of us to really acknowledge that.
Yeah, and that I think is the big impact of technology and online technology in particular on buying, not selling. There's a lot of misconceptions out there. You know, right now, as you know, Mark, we're living through an inflationary period where you've got a lot of pundits saying, oh, everything's going to be virtual selling. Look at the data. I mean, the data is that during maximum lockdown conditions in Canada and the United States, e-commerce as a percentage of total retail sales increased less than 5%.
Wow.
That was in the second quarter of 2020, and it's been trending down every quarter since. Latest quarter, the results were just published last week, 13%. Now, when I ask executives, what do you think that percentage is? I typically get estimates from 30 to 60%.
Wow.
In other words, they're not a little bit out of touch with buying. Many of them are orders of magnitude out of touch. So the first thing is put this in context. And when we put it in context, the reality of buying in most categories, not all, but the reality is that buyers are online and offline multiple times through their buying journey. Now that has two very important implications. One is for salespeople, and that is the days of a salesperson being essentially an organic, walking, talking version of product literature gone. The buyer gets that information with a few clicks. You've got to add more value when you do interact with customers.
Right.
And the other implication is for sales management. Those interactions are important and they need to be understood and managed, but that's a big deal for management, right? Most salespeople are classic individual contributors. And when there's also channels involved, the individual contributor has to be a manager as well as a seller. Not an easy thing to do, but as they say in the gangster movies, you chose this life. This is just the way the world works these days.
You know, it's such a catchphrase, but we bring that up all the time when we're working with teams. There's particularly teams where they have this challenge around accountability, where there's got to be this epiphany. It is difficult, but that's why we need smart people.
Yeah. I mean, it's not the responsibility of the market to adapt to the company. It works the other way around.
What else, by the way, when we're starting to talk this, we're on the process section, and I love the way it's laid out with the people, the process, and the pricing and partners. We kind of jump to stage 2 of the book, or section part 2 of the book. What else on the process side? One of the things that really kind of resonated with me, Frank, I love your approach because you're not tied to any specific sales methodology or system because sales is so context based.
Yeah.
So to come in and say, well, the in the funnel, sales process is the single sales process, we've actually never taken that approach. So because it's just not true. We don't know every business out there. We don't know every industry. We certainly don't know every region. And that's a big thing for us because COVID opened up new markets for us outside of North America. And admittedly, we had a lot of learning to do and still do in that category. But tell me a little bit about some of the key things that these sales leaders or CEOs who are watching this, trying to figure out what do they do moving forward in 2022? What are their keynotes should we mention on process?
Well, I would say, when you think about the next year, I would say a few things. One is, again, let's get back to the basics. Most important thing about selling is buying. Now, the pandemic, especially in a number of B2B markets, has changed companies' criteria for who they consider good suppliers and not so good suppliers. So if you're one of those suppliers and you're selling your product or service, understand what their criteria are today, not yesterday. So that's number one. Number two, what the pandemic has also done out of necessity. If you look at what companies had to do to survive in 2020 and the first half of 2021, it's also changed very often the composition and roles. Here, Mark, I'm going to get academic for a second, but what in academia we would call the buying center? Who's the decision maker? Who's the influencer, et cetera. And once again, that's something that salespeople have to understand how it works today, not yesterday. The third thing that I'd point out is this, and here I'd frankly encourage you to comment because this is a topic where you know at least as much as I do, given your experience. But so much of the really important information about who buys, why, and how in most companies, especially SMB companies, is not in the CRM system. It's lodged in the heads of the individual reps or account managers. And the only way you get at that information is through good performance evaluations and good coaching. But as you know, it is an area where many busy sales managers tend to do what I call drive-by evaluations and very cursory coaching. Coming out of the pandemic, that activity is especially important in sales because when you don't do good coaching, you're not only perpetuating a culture of underperformance, you're inhibiting the flow of vital information about buying. But again, I'd urge you to comment on that because again, you're one of the world's experts on this topic.
Oh, thanks, Frank. I greatly appreciate that. This is a big thing for us when we start to think about the essence of sales strategy. I think, far too often companies, and salespeople get very tactical on the solution. And we think that, just as important is navigating the buyer's organization to figure out how they make decisions, and then just understanding what's important to those decision makers. So, and what is their sort of degree of influence? So what's their role in this process? And a lot of this, admittedly, let's give credit back to, Miller Hyman back in 88, 89. When they came up with their original models, those were valid. They had names and titles for the roles and the buyers, but a lot of that stuff hasn't changed significantly. What changes, in my view, today is companies don't always have a definitive structure for making the buying decision. So I may talk to one person who maps it out for me, but because things are changing so much within companies, somebody who thinks they have the high degree of influence may be surprised 2 weeks later after one executive committee meeting where the opportunity was shared for a decision.
Yeah.
So there's two things we encourage. So first of all, navigating is so critically important. Secondly, triangulating anything you know. So if I know the 3, 4, 5 people who I think are part of the buying decision, I continually triangulate what they know to make sure that things haven't changed, because things change.
Yeah, I think that's right. You know, the way I tend to phrase your point, which I think is a very important one, there are such things as relationships in sales. You know, people, that's sort of an academic discussion. Of course, people buy from people.
Sure they do.
But the nature and composition of relationships changes. When Miller Hyman wrote their book, most of technology was bought by the information technology department.
Right.
Now we know sales and marketing spend more money on technology than the CIO does. That's an important change, and you've got to be able to map that. I agree with you completely.
And Frank, so that's on the process side. I just wanted, just for everybody watching, I think this issue on the first part of your book with the people, I think it's just such a huge one. And even, I think there's a change probably a little bit, even over the last 12 months. Any coaching or advice for all of these CEOs or sales leaders who are saying, what do I do? You know, when everybody on my team's getting a call from somebody right now who's going to offer them 10% more to move.
Yeah.
You know, I've got gaps on the team today. How do I build and maintain and keep, you know, a loyal team that's capable? Any suggestions on the people front?
Well, I mean, I would point out 3 things. I don't think they're revolutionary, but I think they're important. And I think, you know, I no longer at this point in my career shy away from pointing out the obvious, because, you know, the important things in business are easy to say and hard to do, just the opposite of physics. First, I'll get back to what I said earlier. You hire your problems. And when it comes to retaining people, the reality is at the end of the day, you're going to pay market price. But what you should be doing is understanding who you feel that market price is worthy of. And this gets us back to performance evaluations, coaching, etc. That's number 1. Number 2, and this I find is historically and today an underutilized lever. When I talk to most sales leaders and I say, well, who are you looking for your team? Who do you want? What do you need? Basically, I get a checklist of characteristics that only Michelangelo or Michael Jordan could fulfill. You know, some Renaissance man or woman. And my advice is, look, whenever you can hire Michelangelo or Michael Jordan, do it. I'm sure people like that will add value, but most people are not, you know, omnicompetent. But there are levers available to sales leaders that they don't use enough. Deployment, how we deploy the sales force. Technology, do we need our reps doing all the tasks? Or are there places, this is, I think, what the pandemic has illustrated, are there places where less experienced, less expensive people, sometimes even algorithms, can do the job, lead generation, contracting, etc. So using that to figure out how you make the best use of available resources. And then my third comment is the ongoing one. You know, the human resource people quote this aphorism all the time, and there's a lot of research to support their point of view. People join companies and they leave managers. So at the end of the day, managers, including sales managers, must manage and ultimately be worthy of talent. And then you will pay what you need to pay. That part, I think, is, you know, you can commiserate about it, but the market will determine that.
Well, yeah, great point, Frank. And you know, just on this people topic, one of the questions that came through was, you know, the role of compensation and bonuses, you know, in that whole. So I love the idea. You're going to pay market. You're going to pay market. But I think a lot of particularly medium-sized entities, they've got sales organizations between about 3 and 30. They struggle on that mix between, you know, base salary and target income. And again, it's context based. So what that mix should look like should be the role, the actual quota, the solution, the size of the deal, the sell cycle duration, the size of the target market. Do we have a tiny, target market? Do we have lots of opportunity out there? So I think there's this constant question mark in terms of how to set this whole thing up so that it's effective. Outside of reading the book, which most of the people on this webinar and this podcast today are clearly going to do because there's so much good stuff in there. Any other thoughts on sources outside of your book or sources of information on compensation data so that they can stay market?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think a couple of things I'd say about that topic. And then I think when it comes to the data, I'm trying to remember the phrase, but the jungle telegraph, that's the phrase. The jungle telegraph is usually, sufficient. You'll know what your competitors are offering with signing bonuses or whatever. Yeah. But I think when it comes to compensation, especially for SMB companies, because SMB companies typically are not going to be the Amazons and Walmarts of their market, right? They're focusing on niches. I think there are a couple of things you have to recognize about sales comp. Sales compensation is a necessary but insufficient cause of getting the behaviors you want. Mm-hmm. If you pay people to do X and ask them for Y, it's not going to happen. But even when you've got that aligned, let's get back to coaching, performance management, you still have to manage. That's number one. Number two, I think even before you get into issues of should it be 70-30, 60-40, whatever, you have to ask yourself, what am I paying for? And ultimately, you're paying for those tasks where the salesperson makes a difference, as opposed to marketing or service or product or whatever. And the reality is most comp systems don't do that in sales. The data I'm about to cite, Mark, has been actually remarkably consistent throughout my career. It'll vary by maybe 5 percentage points in a year, but about 70% of sales comp, bonus plans, incentive systems, bonus reps on volume, irrespective of the profitability of the sale, the cost to serve, et cetera. Now, in a sales comp system like that, the message to salespeople is very clear, and don't kid yourself, they understand it within minutes of reading the plan. And the message is there is no such thing as a bad sale. Go forth and multiply. And that fragments, especially in SMB business. So you want to understand, even before you get to numbers, you want to understand what is it I am paying them to do? What are the important tasks? And again, because of the pandemic, because of changes in buying, those tasks are changing in many, many businesses. Then you can get into the numbers.
Well, the point is so relevant, Frank, and it leads, by the way, to part 3 of the book. So part 1, people, part 2, process, part 3, pricing and partners. But I would say with our consulting clients in the medium business space, this is an ongoing issue for every single CEO. Yeah. And at times there's a belief that, okay, as far as the margin's concerned, if we set up a pricing sort of process where nothing can go in front of a client or a prospect that hasn't been vetted by finance, and finance has to go to an exception board for anything that's got an EBITDA below X, Y, or Z, that maybe we can protect the margin. So I'm not sure your comments there, but the other thing that the CEOs come back to ask about is something you referenced, which is they're frustrated because they think the teams go to the market with pricing by thinking about cost instead of going to market with pricing that considers value to the customer. Yeah. I've heard, by the way, of course, I know it was in your book, but I would say in the last month from 2 or 3 different large consulting clients of ours, this exact conversation has come up where the CEO said, hey, I've got a frustration. We think about things in terms of cost instead of value. Let's talk about the difference of those two things and any suggestions you've got.
Yeah, but let me also get back to your first comment, which I would agree is very representative. You know, if finance can really figure out, you know, costs and price, and we don't let the children in sales handle price, then we've got it fixed. It's a good theory, but it's a theory where the exceptions, I think, in my experience, outnumber the times when it works. At the end of the day, sales in most businesses, you know, a market never buys anything, Mark. Only specific customers do. We customize, we affect our cost
we do.
to serve. So that's a very deceptive metric. At the end of the day, we need that information. Now, I think your other question was about pricing and cost versus
value pricing.
Well, I mean, you know, look, cost plus pricing is still the default option for most companies. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One reason is that it's easier to justify, right? And by the way, there is research that supports that, but I would argue that's what marketing and sales are about. Marketing and sales, call it what you want, are about making the target customer aware of value.
Right.
The second reason, I think, is that many companies default to that because they can't, either they don't understand the value at the customer,
right, or
in some cases they're too lazy to do that. Well, in that case, you know, you're going to be pricing that way. But I think pricing and value are intimately linked, and in today's world, it's especially important because the units of value for many customers are changing. And this, I think, is an opportunity for many, many companies, but it's only an opportunity that you can activate if you understand value at that customer, and then you have a sales force that's capable of articulating that value.
Right. Excuse me. I think that is so critically important. And one of the things, just for the teams watching this today, I'd ask them to consider is, I would say far too often in our experience today when we're working with clients, Frank, we'll ask somebody about, forget our business case, share the key elements of the client's business case that they're putting together to make a decision. And on meaningful purchases, even with large technology companies, meaningful purchases, they have no idea of what that business case looks like. And in some cases, it's news to them that there would actually be a business case. But our experience has been, if you're going to take something to an executive group or executive board, there's always a financial business case because they have dozens, if not hundreds, of other ways to spend their money.
Yeah, I mean, you know, my mentor would, you may have read some of his books, Theodore Levitt. You know,
I didn't know he was your mentor.
Oh yes, and you know, Ted's phrase for this, I think, is still one that abides. People don't buy 2-inch drill bits, they buy 2-inch holes. They buy the outcomes. There's always a business case. Most customers do not wake up in the morning saying, oh boy, I want to pay a higher price. Of course they don't, but they are interested in value. And think about what the pandemic has done. The pandemic has altered many companies' perceptions of who's a good supplier. Because in many, many industries, a number of customers had to be put on allocation and some were not allocated supplies. So whether or not they called you a key account, there was proof of that in whether you got the components you needed. That has changed perceptions of value. And it's the seller's responsibility to be in touch with that and, when possible, exploit that change in your favor.
Yeah, very, very good. Hey, Frank, so we've got a couple of questions that from the team here that I'll throw out for quick answers. We're keeping an eye on your time for sure. So this is a very high-level generic one, but we'll share. Joel Young said, is marketing the main driver of sales? And will the role of the salesperson be diminishing over time? And I think maybe Joel has read some recent books by Tony Hughes and others who've been guests on this show talking about in the future, there'll be a lot fewer salespeople around because of technology taking away some low value tasks. Any thoughts or comments on that?
Yeah, I disagree with that point of view. And I think that both history and data supports my point of view. I mean, look, the reality is we've been hearing this throughout the 21st century. Remember, we're now in the third decade of the 21st century. Yeah. And the reality is that the number of salespeople, and as you pointed out earlier, most people who do sales for a living are not called salespeople.
Right.
They're called managing partners, or, think about financial institutions. Everybody's vice president.
Business development, all of these other named vice presidents, anything but salesperson.
But the number of people in sales has increased consistently throughout the 21st century, even as the internet has gotten more powerful, more broadband, etc. I don't think that's going to change. I mean, we're social creatures. I already cited the data about, 13% of even retail sales are e-commerce. People do business with people. Secondly, and again, for the data and examples, look at the book. I think the reality is that technology is having exactly the opposite effect on the relationship between marketing and sales. The reality is technology is allowing sales organizations to do things that as recently as a decade ago would clearly have been in marketing's domain. Think about inbound marketing, what the HubSpots of the world allow companies to do. Most of that content marketing, the email lists, et cetera, are now handled by sales, not marketing. The issue, I think, and again, I think this is part of what drives turnover at the leadership level in sales. The issue, if I'm candid, is does a sales organization know what the hell it's doing? There was a reason we had marketing. But my take is that I think it's a more perilous job to be CMO in most companies than it is to be CSO. That, I think, is the reality.
Wow. That in itself, the interplay between those two could be the topic of our next conversation. But I'll certainly keep an eye on your time, Frank. One more from the team here. Our friend John Noble has sent a question, tactical one, but interested in your quick opinion. Tactical: should salespeople be involved or responsible for collections after a sale? Is there training or coaching available for sales on collections management? We'll take the second part of that, but the first part, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, just a few things. The first issue is, why do we want our people to do that? All right. Again, one of the things the pandemic, I think, demonstrated to companies out of necessity is that their contracting and collections mechanisms were unnecessarily labor intensive, right? DocuSign, other things can be used. And the reality is, whenever you can minimize the amount of time a salesperson is spending doing that, you're increasing time for them to do prospecting and selling. So that's number one. Number two, my answer to the question of why would I want them involved in collections is because there's something about ongoing account management and customer lifetime value that they will be exposed to and can influence in that process. If they can't, I don't understand why I would even want to train them in doing that. Let finance be the bad guys and say, hey, you now owe us this money. So again, this gets me back to my earlier point about how deployment and using the division of labor and sales activities is underutilized in most organizations, especially SMB organizations. You're usually paying more for that salesperson than you are for somebody who calls up every 2 weeks and says, hey, the bill is overdue.
Right.
That would be my question. Why are we doing this? It doesn't make sense to do something efficiently that people shouldn't be doing in the first place. Peter Drucker pointed that out decades ago, and he was right.
Yeah, great point. Team, I'm going to just remind everybody, sales management that works. I'd like to thank those who sent questions in through the chat. We will please send your addresses to Mark Cox at inthefunnel.com. You can sell it right to me, Mark Cox at inthefunnel.com. We're going to get you a signed copy of Sales Management That Works, How to Sell in a World That Never Stops Changing. For those who are not getting the free version of the book, Frank, how can we get in touch with you and how can we get a copy of this book?
Well, you know, I've got a website, although I confess I don't go to the website very often. I've got a LinkedIn page, although I confess I don't go there very often. But all of those are ways to contact me. And then, you know, there's via Harvard Business School. I think there are faculty pages there that describe what each faculty member does as well.
Fantastic. And team, obviously Amazon.com for all of Frank's books. Frank, first of all, I am going to be in your executive classroom in the near future for sure. So every time we chat, I just make this note that said, I have to be in one of those classes. I love talking to you. We could talk for 8 hours. But on behalf of everybody at In the Funnel and the folks on watching this podcast, I just wanted to say thank you so much. What a pleasure it is speaking with you again. All the best to you and yours for a great holiday season. And we'll chat again in 2022. And very soon, I'm going to be one of those executives sitting in your classroom, learning from you for multiple days in a row.
Well, Mark, I thank you very, very much. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. And you remind me, and this will be, I guess, my way of saying goodbye to our audience, a comment a guest executive made in one of my classes last semester when he said goodbye to the students. He said, now you remember, stay positive, but test negative. So let me say that as well.
Okay, Frank. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. All the best, Frank.
Bye-bye.